Since the cost of replacing an air conditioning compressor can be quite high, replacing it yourself can be very rewarding. Though the actual procedure itself is not difficult, you should be aware of certain technical facts about your automotive air conditioning system for your personal safety. The system is charged with a compressed gas called a refrigerant. Since you have decided that it is necessary to replace the air conditioning compressor, never unbolt, loosen, or remove any of the refrigeration components without first removing the refrigerant compressed gas from inside of the refrigeration system. You should have the gas removed by a professional using environmentally safe and legal methods of removing the refrigerant gas and storing it in a proper manner. It should not simply be released into the atmosphere. Never open the refrigeration system access ports or unbolt any component without first removing the compressed gas. Serious personal injury can result. You should be aware of the fact that the material in the air conditioning system, the refrigerant, boils at minus 21 degrees Fahrenheit. What this means is that if it comes in contact with your skin, it will freeze it immediately. So always cover exposed skin areas. Place the safety goggles over eyes. Second, if the refrigerant gas is exposed to your eyes, it could blind you. So always wear safety goggles for eye protection. These words of caution are not meant to scare you, but merely to inform you that the compressed refrigerant gas, if handled properly, is perfectly safe. But if handled carelessly, it can cause serious damage to yourself or to those assisting you. The first step is to always put on a set of safety goggles. Safety goggles can be purchased from your auto parts store and should be considered mandatory whenever performing any service repairs on an automotive air conditioning system. In addition to the safety goggles, you will need certain basic tools. A socket set, either metric or English depending on your particular car. A set of open-ended or boxed-end wrenches. And you will need a set of screwdrivers, some special tools that you may need, or a ruler, a plastic measuring cup, a small funnel, some rags, and a fender cover. On some applications, you may also need a pair of snap ring pliers, which can be either purchased or rented from your auto parts store. You will also need to purchase some special compressor refrigerant oil and order the correct compressor assembly for your automobile. Your store counter person can help you with these items. With everything ready and the refrigerant safely removed from the vehicle, you are ready to begin the compressor replacement procedure. Position the vehicle on a hard, flat work surface to begin the repair. Set the parking brake. Remove the keys from the ignition and open the hood. Now, gather your tools and start to work. You should cover any painted surfaces of the car with a fender cover or a large rag or towel. Remember, before you do any more work, make sure you have your safety goggles over your eyes. Unplug the compressor's electrical clutch lead and position the electrical wiring out of the work area. Next, remove any components including air cleaners, vacuum lines, ductwork, and any other components to completely expose your air conditioning compressor. You should note that in some applications, the compressor will have to be removed from the bottom of the vehicle. In these instances, it will be necessary to jack up the vehicle and properly support it on jack stands in order to gain access to the compressor. Follow each of the refrigeration hoses from the compressor down each line until you come to the service access port. The access ports are threaded receptacles that normally have a brass or black plastic cap over them. Once the cap is removed, it will expose a valve called a Schrader valve, similar to the valve on a tire. It is extremely important that you do not depress this valve unless you are sure that the refrigerant has been removed from the vehicle. If any of the refrigerant gas is still in the system, it will be under pressure. Clean each of the access ports off thoroughly. Using a shop rag or a degreaser, clean any grease or loose dirt from the back of the air conditioning compressor where the refrigeration hoses connect. It is important that these hoses be thoroughly cleaned prior to the refrigeration hose removal. After choosing the appropriate socket or box wrench, loosen the refrigeration manifold bolt on the rear of the air conditioning compressor. If you hear compressed refrigerant gas leaking from the system, stop the removal process and wait until the leak stops. It is possible that even though you had the refrigerant gas removed by a professional, some residual pressure has remained in the compressor's cylinders. It should stop quickly. Remember, do not allow the compressed gas to come in contact with any exposed skin or your eyes. Once the bolt on the refrigerant manifold is completely removed, carefully wiggle and remove the manifold and hose assembly. Move the hose out of the way, but do not bend or stretch any of the aluminum piping or the rubber hoses. You may find it more convenient to tie up the hoses to hold them out of the way while you continue the repair procedure. Once the manifold and hose assembly is moved out of the way, cover the open end of the hose with a clean rag to prevent any dirt from entering the refrigeration system. Now loosen the compressor mounting bolts. Depending on the particular make and model, there can be as few as 2 or as many as 4 mounting bolts. You will need the correct socket or box wrench. It is not recommended that you use an open-ended wrench, as it may tend to round the torque bolt head. First, loosen the top slide bolt, but don't completely remove it. Next, loosen the pivot bolt on the bottom. In some installations, they use more than 2 lower bolts, as on this Monte Carlo. One comes from the back and one from the front. The bolts are quite long. In some cases, they go completely through the compressor. It may take some time to completely unthread these bolts. When all of the bolts are loose, move the compressor to release the tension from the drive belt. Slide the belt over the pulley assembly and position it out of the way. It is a good idea at this point to examine the belt and make sure that it is not glazed, cracked, or frayed. If it is, it should be replaced along with the compressor. Continue to unthread all of the mounting bolts and remove them from the compressor or bracket assembly. It is very important that you position the bolts so that you will remember which ones go in which positions. Also, you should know where any shims, sleeves, or spacers have been utilized so that you may correctly position the compressor on reinstallation. You may even find it more convenient to slide the sleeves or shims back over the bolts and position them in a safe place for future reference. Some people even find it convenient if, as the bolts are removed, they are color-coded with a marker or in a particular position in the bracket or compressor. Once all the bolts are removed, lift the compressor and bracket assemblies off the engine. Place the compressor on a clean work surface. Scrape any loose dirt or grease from the compressor's sub-bracket. When removing the retaining bolts, it is extremely important to note their location so they can be reinstalled into the replacement compressor in the exact position from which they were removed. The sub-bracket will have to be transferred onto the new unit. When the compressor disassembly is complete, clean up your work area, gather your tools, and get ready to reassemble the car. Now is a good time to take a break. Wash your hands and rewind the tape. View the program to this point and make sure that you have not missed any of the steps. Before we begin reassembly, it is important to review the assembly procedure before starting the repair. Let's begin the reassembly procedure by matching the old compressor to the new one, just to make sure that we have the correct replacement. You should be aware that there are many varieties of the R4 compressor installed as original equipment. The differences lie in two areas: their particular style of the clutch, the number of belts, and the pulley diameter. And the second area is whether your particular compressor used an electrical switch in the back of the compressor. Position both the replacement compressor and your original compressor side by side on your workbench. Start by positioning the compressors with the clutch facing up and measure the pulley diameters with a ruler. They should be within 1/4 of an inch of each other. Next, make sure that both have the same number and style of belt grooves, and that you match the distance from the front of the compressor body to the edge of the belt groove. Use the ruler to measure this distance. It should be exact. Now carefully match the two compressors for the other characteristics. Place them side by side and rotate them till the raised body strap is at 12 o'clock, and position them so the clutch faces you. Locate the position of the compressor's electromagnetic clutch coil plug. They should both be in the same relative position. This is at 6 o'clock, 2 o'clock, or even 10 o'clock. If they are different, you will either need an electrical extender lead or exchange the compressor for the correct one. Next, reposition the compressors with the clutch facing down. Make sure they are in the same relative position. That is, that the straps are in the same clock position. Now note carefully if your original compressor has any electrical plugs or pressure switches mounted in the back of the compressor. Your compressor will either have a switch which looks like this, or will not have a switch, in which case the compressor will have no holes drilled in the casting. Most replacement compressors are supplied with a plug in the switch location. If your compressor does not require a switch, the plugged compressor can be installed as is. If your particular compressor requires a switch, it will be necessary to utilize the snap ring pliers to remove the plug in the replacement compressor. Then transfer the switch from the old compressor into the replacement unit. Next, carefully remove the metal or rubber plug on the back of the compressor's refrigerant outlet ports. Don't be alarmed if a gas sound is present. The system is shipped with nitrogen to protect the unit during transit. Once the plug is completely removed, it is extremely important to the life of the replacement compressor that you follow these steps Exactly. First, drain the oil from the old compressor into the plastic measuring cup. This is easily accomplished by merely inverting the compressor over the cup until all the oil has drained out. Inspect the oil for contamination. It should be yellowish in color, not dark or black. It should also not have any metal or plastic particles in the oil. If any are present, you must flush the entire system, install a new accumulator or receiver dryer, and install a new expansion tube. Also, you should install an inline filter in the refrigerant lines to protect the replacement compressor. To service the system completely, including flushing the contaminants, installing an inline filter, and a new expansion tube, view the associated tape in our series, Servicing Your Air Conditioning System. Once the old compressor has completely drained, write down the quantity of oil that was removed. Then discard the old oil into a suitable disposal container. Completely wipe out and clean the measuring cup. Then drain the oil from the new compressor into the cup and note the quantity. If you removed less than 3.5 ounces of oil from the old compressor, you should install a minimum of 3.5 ounces of oil into the new compressor. If more than 3.5 ounces of oil was drained from the old unit, reinstall that amount of oil into the new unit. In other words, you should install a minimum of 3.5 ounces of oil into the replacement compressor. Reinstall new refrigerant oil into the rear access port of the compressor. It will be easier to install it through the port marked S. Do not rotate the compressor at this time or the oil will merely pump back out of the unit. When all of the oil has been reinstalled into the compressor, reinstall the rubber plug to prevent it from leaking out. Using the old compressor as a guide, reinstall the compressor's sub-bracket. Thread the bolts in by hand so that they will not be cross-threaded. Install both brackets. This particular compressor has one bracket to hold the unit on and one bracket to assist in tightening the belt tension on the compressor.
No idea where this one might be.
The old one is a mark on it.
Here.
Rotate the other compressor.
Hold the compressor on its side. Place the bracket against the workbench and torque the bolts into position. You are now ready to reinstall the compressor on the car. Lower the compressor into position on the mounting bracket. Position it so that the holes are aligned and ready to receive the bolts. In this installation, it is easier to install the lower pivot bolts prior to installing the top one. Always thread the bolts in by hand and do not force them with a wrench. You might cross-thread them. Don't forget, this vehicle uses lower bolts, so make sure they are both in position prior to installing the upper bolts. Do not tighten the bolts at this time. Slide the belt into position on the compressor's clutch. You should always double check that the belt is in position on both the water pump, alternator, power steering, and crankshaft, and any other accessories that are also driven by the same belt. Now install the top bolt. In this particular vehicle, remember that we have removed a spacer on disassembly. Sliding the bolt in from the rear through the bracket, insert the spacer and continue to insert the bolts all the way through the compressor housing and then thread it into position by hand. Do not utilize the wrench at this time.
Kick your fingers around from a different angle where you can see a thread.
Using a half-inch ratchet assembly or short breaker bar, insert the square drive of the ratchet into the square cut hole in the compressor's bracket assembly. It might be more convenient to have someone assist you. Draw the compressor across the slide mount until the tension is on the belt. Then tighten the bolts with a ratchet one at a time while the assistant continues to hold the compressor. If you're doing it yourself, you'll have to alternately tighten the lower and upper bolts, check the belt tension, and repeat the procedure alternately until you have the correct tension and the bolts are tight. The last step is to make sure all the bolts are properly tightened, both lowers and uppers, and check the belt tension. You are now ready to reinstall the hose and manifold assembly. Once you have removed the tie straps, position the manifold for installation. Remove the rubber plug from the back of the compressor. That is the rubber cork that you installed to prevent the oil from leaking out. You should note that there are two O-rings inserted into the back of the compressor where the manifold plugs into position. Check to make sure that they are in position. If they have fallen out, it will be necessary to purchase two new ones. Never reuse the old ones. Lightly lubricate the two O-rings with fresh, clean refrigerant oil. Position the refrigerant pipes and manifold assembly into the back of the air conditioning holes. Install the compressor manifold bolt and tighten into position with your fingers. Use a socket and short-handled ratchet and tighten the bolt. The compressor is aluminum. Do not apply excessive torque since it is possible to strip out the threads. Locate and reinstall the compressor's electrical clutch lead. Lastly, plug in any pressure switch leads which were disconnected on disassembly. Reinstall any vacuum hoses, air ducts, or the air cleaner that were removed prior to disassembly. You've completed the replacement of the compressor. The only step that remains is the removal of the air in the system and the installation of the refrigerant gas. This step should be left to a knowledgeable individual with the correct tools to do the job. You've saved a lot of money replacing the compressor yourself. Since most do-it-yourselfers do not have access to the proper equipment or tools, we recommend that you simply reinstall the service caps at this time and allow a professional to reinstall the refrigerant gas. One more last word of caution. If you're not reinstalling the refrigerant gas yourself, disconnect the compressor's electrical clutch lead to prevent accidental compressor engagement until gas is reinstalled in the compressor. Congratulations! You've completed the task yourself, and that can be very rewarding. If you like this method of instruction, you will find it's easy to do lots of other repairs on your vehicle that many of you have never attempted before.